Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new Redefining Security podcast. Have you ever thought that we are selling cybersecurity insincerely, buying it indiscriminately, and deploying it ineffectively? Perhaps we are. So let's look at how we can organize a successful InfoSec program that integrates people, process, technology, and culture to drive growth and protect business value. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Imperva is the cybersecurity leader whose mission is to protect data and all paths to it with a suite of integrated application and data security solutions. Learn more at imperva.com.
Archer empowers organizations to manage multiple dimensions of risk on one platform with on-premises and software-as-a-service offerings, and quickly implement industry-standard processes and best practices for advanced risk management maturity, informed decision-making, and enhanced business performance. Learn more at archerirm.com. EdgeScan offers continuous vulnerability intelligence as a service, accurately identifying vulnerabilities and exposures across the full stack. All threats are verified by cybersecurity experts, providing exploitable risk and remediation guidance, virtually false positive free. Learn more at edgescan.com.
Here we are. We're redefining security here on ITSP Magazine. This is Sean Martin, and today it's all about software development and the life cycle of that, the role of quality assurance, and the role of security in building products that hopefully care about intellectual property and customer privacy and all kinds of good stuff. So I have two good friends, and they're actually friends of mine who I've known for many, many years. If you could see us, I'm the gray one. But we've spent a lot of time together in different places. And I have Cassio Goldschmidt and Tom Morrissey on with me. Hey, guys.
Hey, Sean.
So quality assurance and security is our topic. Tom and I spent many, many years building up quality assurance teams at Symantec and trying to figure out how best to integrate quality assurance with engineering and product development. And I think there's probably a lot of parallels with that to security assessments, not just quality assurance, but security assurance, let's say, in development. And that's what we're going to figure out. But before we get to that point, a quick word from each of you of who you are and what you're up to now. So, Tom, I'll actually start with you.
Yeah. Well, this is Tom Morrissey. As Sean mentioned, we've known each other a long time, worked together for a very long time, and at a software security company. And currently, right now, I just started a new gig here as a director working at OpSWAT, and I'm running a product team there, cross-platform product team for their different solutions, which is great. And this is a really critical topic for them as well, because they're another software security vendor out there.
And I can't wait to see where this goes. But Cassio.
Hey, so I'm Cassio Goldschmidt. I'm the CISO and Senior Director of Service Titan. And I know Sean and Tom for over a decade now, which is quite a long time. I've worked in engineering teams developing products that were used by millions of people. Then I moved and specialized in security, leading an application security team worldwide. Then moving to SaaS companies, providing solutions that are in the cloud, multi-tenant, and also some consulting that I did in the past on proactive security and how to best implement security as part of the development lifecycle. Currently, I'm with Service Titan, where I am the CISO there.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to ask a very simple question, and this will probably get us started. And Tom, I'm going to turn it to you in your view on the parallels between quality assurance and I'll call it security assurance in a product. And perhaps your view on the current state of things in terms of, is that separate team, separate processes, separate communications, or are there overlaps?
Absolutely overlaps. I think one of the things that you mentioned that we struggled with early on when we were working together on QA teams was, the basic age-old question: how do you find defects earlier in the cycle? And I think that as that's evolved over the years, we've now seen where we've moved into more of like agile type, where they're using Scrum or Kanban or different processes. And the basic idea is really to integrate this type of assurance and testing along with the development throughout the process. So whether you're doing the initial architectural reviews and the component designs and implementations and white box and black box testing, that you're taking all of this into account as early as possible. And I think in keeping with the spirit of that mindset, that most QA teams, I think, traditionally think of themselves as just testing the features. They're testing maybe user experience, and if I click on this button, does it work? Or do these features work? Do these APIs work as intended? But there's also the outside pressures. You've got legal pressures, right? You've got compliance pressures and security pressures. You've got localization pressures. And I think that all of that needs to be considered in that integrated testing. So in that, in those sprints, in that planning, that it has to be part of the same team. I think that there's probably very few services, I would think, that fall outside of it. But I think it absolutely has to be a holistic approach as the team delivers their pieces, both at a component or API level, and then also expanded out to the system level as you're going. So absolutely integrated.
Cassio, Tom touched on the very important point of getting it earlier in the life cycle, right? So I think in DevSecOps we call it shifting left. I don't know if we want to go there with this, but I guess what I'm wondering is, looking at quality assurance, Tom touched on use cases and features, and those are typically driven by a product requirements document, and maybe before that a market requirements document that says this is kind of what we're trying to accomplish. Do you see a role for security to be baked into the MRD and the PRD, and what does that look like?
Yeah. So as Tom said, there are a number of similarities in the goals for security and QA. I think overall the goal is it's all about quality, right? Both teams are trying to get the best product possible in the hands of the customer. However, there are also some things that don't quite overlap, right? So for example, security is also about privacy. Right, security has other goals. They are very different from what QA does. QA is always trying to emulate what the user does, and for security, we have a different approach. We have to actually do the things that the software is not supposed to do, right? And with that, that's where things start to diverge. But then again, because both want to actually shift left, as you mentioned, right? There are a number of things that both teams can work together and get done. So when we talk, for example, about reviewing architecture and understanding the system upfront so that test cases can be created, that type of meeting can serve both teams. It can serve security to put their black hats and start looking at the system and say, how can I game the system? While QA is thinking, how can I actually test and emulate what the user will do with the system, right? So it's really important to actually work together and try to get those things done up front.
And Cassio, because you just said the role of security is to get the product to do something it's not supposed to. My thought is that isn't the only thing, because I also feel that there's value in security going through the user interface, let's say, and
Yes.
see what is possible. And maybe it's a conversation around white box versus black box and the role of both of those, right?
You're absolutely right. And the way that we think in security, and some companies already have different nomenclatures to this kind of things, is security testing and penetration test. So, for example, QA has to go and input data in order to test the systems. So does security. We have to input data. The kind of data that we're inputting is different, right? When it says, please enter a name, QA is going to enter a name, John, right? We're going to enter something like a script alert script, right? Or some type of SQL injection. Those things actually are derived from the case, which is just input, tester inputs, right? And those things can be automated and use a lot of the tool sets that QA use. So, for example, you can go to OWASP and get the OWASP cheat sheets for SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and do this automation and make part of QA and create automation processes based on that. And we call those things security testing. Penetration test, which was what I was alluding to, is a little bit different because basically you're trying to do something like elevation of privilege or try to destroy a configuration file that in a multi-tenant environment, somebody would not be able to actually get to their account, and you would knock your competition out of the system that you both use. So those are the kind of things that I consider more in the security side. But as you said, there are a lot of opportunities here to actually automate the security testing using the same tool set that QA uses.
Yeah, I agree with that, Cassio. And I would say that, one of the key things about it is, in the past, I know when we've done the types of security testing, it was often a separate team and sometimes outsourced. And it was something that, got handed off, and it was, very much like a black box service where you didn't know what they did, and they'd go off and they may spend 3 months, and then they come back and they write you a report, and then you have to figure out what's important, what's not, and how do you fix it, and what will legal let you ship with and not. Now I think it has to be much more of that integrated conversation, that back and forth. There's no reason why when you're planning up front a project and your designs and that you should know already what the security team is going to be testing. They need to be part of that discussion at the table so that everybody's well aware of what's coming, because then you can plan for it. Hopefully none of it's a surprise.
Let's talk about that, because the surprise comes if you don't know what the risk is. And even just in this conversation, we quickly get into the technical elements of engineering and testing. And that's kind of why I was pulling on the PRD and even the MRD stuff earlier, because I think ultimately it's a business decision. At some point, I'm sure we'll talk about this product's not ready to launch, right? Who makes that decision and who gets to flip that switch? But if you don't know what the risk is, how can you prepare to either, well, at worst, prevent it from happening once it's built, but even better, build it so that the risk doesn't even exist if possible. So how do we, as QA and security and engineering, come together to understand what the real risk is?
And that's the paradox of security, right? So, for example, if I, as a security professional, if I don't find any vulnerabilities, does it mean the software is perfect, or my team is just incompetent because they didn't find anything? And most likely there are things to be found. I think, Sean, what you're talking about is a lot to do with the definition of done. When do we ship software, right? What's the criteria there? And when you look at security and QA, you're going to see that the way that we actually find our vulnerabilities or bugs is a little bit different. If you plot a graph For QA, usually the way it starts is QA starts the process, and then slowly but surely, you're going to see an increase, which is kind of a line going up of the number of defects that you find in the system. At some point, that line will become a plateau. And that means the ROI for QA is no longer there, right? In other words, you are simply putting more effort, and there are very few things to be found. For security, the line is a little bit different. It's kind of like an S shape, because first you have to really understand the system. And by understanding the system, I mean you have to do what QA does, which is to understand how the system works and understanding the underlying technology that is used in order to find vulnerabilities. So the line really starts very flat. And suddenly you start looking at the way things work, and you start, you just hit the jackpot. And then you start finding vulnerabilities, one after the other, up to a point that you're going to reach that plateau. But the line looks more like an S than just a curve that goes up and then flattens at some point. So we both are going to reach the same place at some point eventually, and that's when the software is ready. But you can only declare the software to be ready if QA has a really good definition of done, and that means that you must have a good definition of your test cases. So you know your test cases, then you can say, yes, things are passing, and then move to the next level, to the next step, I would say.
Yeah, and Tom, you mentioned outsourced, and many people listening to this might immediately go to, well, I've outsourced this to a company, and that may very well be the case. I think in your definition, I believe it was a shared service within the company. So I want to touch a little bit on that and your perspective, and then Cassio probably has some thoughts on this as well. Just when is it, doing nothing is not the right answer. I'll just go ahead and say that. So if you don't have the internal wherewithal, resources, understanding, technology, whatever processes, perhaps use a partner to help. If you're building a lot of stuff, maybe a shared service might be helpful. But when is it appropriate to stand up a dedicated team per product? Or is it better, if you're going to do that, to integrate it into QA, or does it integrate into dev? Or so it's kind of a bit of a spectrum there. So maybe your thoughts on that range of options.
You touched on a few different ones there, Sean, but I would say my use of the term outsourced could be whether it's an internal shared service of a company or an external company, and there's nothing wrong with either one of those. It's really more of ensuring that it's not just a handoff and that you don't talk to them again for 3 months until they come back with the results. There absolutely has to be that partnership throughout the entire life cycle, the communication back and forth between whichever team that you're working with, outsourced, the shared service, or on the team itself. And then in terms of QA team versus dev team, in the agile world, it's one team, but I would say it's more of, as you look at it, a matter of experience and a matter of size. I mean, I've been on projects where you might only need one person, depending on what it was you were doing. If it was just an inline release or something like that, you might need that one person with that expertise who can come in and work with the team versus a large new project you're going to take 18 months to get out the door. And you may need a separate team in the sense of, another set of bodies, 8 to 10 people that might be working on it. But they have to work alongside the main engineering team that's developing and testing. And again, going back to that communication.
Yeah, sorry, Tom, because I remember, and so much has changed since I was doing this, so I don't know what's new that changes this view, but I remember a lot of the work we were trying to accomplish was to have a common understanding, a common vocabulary, a common view of the use cases or the tests that were going to be run. And ultimately, I think the holy grail was to get engineering to do all the QA tests so that QA could just validate. And I don't know if that's possible with security or not, but is that an option?
I think it is an option, but in my observation, as a holy grail, I don't think it's attainable. I honestly don't think that engineers and developers necessarily think like their end customers, their users, and that. And that's a challenge. And I think when you're too close to something, implementation wise and design wise, that you won't get that outside in perspective. And I think you need that on a team, and you need people separated. And while you can use quality assurance engineers to help automate and build those test frameworks, you still need black box testers that can stand outside and just poke holes at it and not be concerned about, is it AWS or Azure or Google infrastructure. They just want to poke holes in it. They just in a reasonable way. And then you've got the security experts that are going to try to poke holes in it in an unreasonable way, because that's their job. I see Cassia smiling.
Yeah, for us, the testing, external testing versus internal testing, there are so many flavors to consider. And you also have to consider the secrecy of the information and how people are being motivated to do the testing, right? So, for example, some companies have the luxury of creating their own security team that will do penetration test. And their mission is really to dive deep into understanding the product, to find that big vulnerability that you really need to know how the product works. At the same time, you might hire a penetration test team for a couple of weeks to actually look at your product, and they will look at exploitation of the frameworks that you use, common components, things they saw in other places that your security team might not be aware, and come up with some really great findings, right? That sometimes are very widely known in specific technologies that the team just didn't have exposure. And then there are other things that you can do. For example, internal testing, you can use people, as we discussed before, but you could also incentivize people to find vulnerabilities by creating an internal bug bounty program, right? In other words, rewards with bonus and things like that, your people. But there were cases in companies that I've heard where QA and engineering actually try to work together, creating vulnerabilities and then finding vulnerabilities in order to get the payment, right? And if you have an external bug bounty, you have no idea who is going to be testing. All you know is that people will actually sell the vulnerability for money, and that can be very scary, right, for some companies. I always say that Bitcoin, there's no reason why people would report a vulnerability when each Bitcoin $60,000. Just keep to yourself, because the payment is right there, right? That's where the money is. And finally, there's the case that you can actually use companies overseas to do your penetration test, or companies in the US. And it really depends on the type of company that you are. You might say, yeah, it's cheaper to do overseas, and you have really good quality. Or if you're selling to the government, for example, it's just a no-go. You cannot do tests, let's say, in China, right? Security testing at least, and still wanting to sell to the government, you're definitely going to have miss some really big customers. I think Tom has some really great experience with overseas QA, and it's also really fascinating to see how it can work, around the clock and so on.
Yeah, maybe Tom, you can touch on that a little bit, whatever you're comfortable sharing. But the around the clock point, I'd like to explore a bit more, because we touched earlier on it's done, right? And that assumes there's a line. We reach the line. I remember days where we'd work nearly 24 hours for days on end, and then we'd release, and then we'd take a couple of weeks off because we're just fried. Risks and vulnerabilities don't take time off, and bad actors and attackers don't take time off. So how do we? So taking that in mind, coupled with the fact that there aren't necessarily 6-month product cycles any longer, right? This continuous delivery, where I know some large media companies deliver every few minutes a new release of technology and applications. So how do we get to the point of around the clock, 24/7? You're putting stuff out. Maybe there is a schedule of a big release, but how do we manage continuous security assessments?
Good question. And I would say, as a top level answer, having the around the clock coverage helps. I remember those days you mentioned, long days. There was nobody to hand off to at the end of the day. So having somebody to hand off to another team that can pick up and run for another eight hours, it has been a big help. It's really improved life cycles to be able to speed them up, especially in the world of CI/CD. And in some cases, people, like you said, they'll have thousands of releases every day, every moment posting on their web. If you're an application, whether it's mobile, primarily mobile, you might have a release every 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. I see some of my apps getting updated. And so, one, you have to assure the quality of what's going out, but two, you want to make sure, as we're talking about here, the security of what's going out. You want to ensure that it's not, none of that privacy is being broken. And that's been one of the bigger challenges. Some of the reasons that Cassio mentions when you outsource or offshore, and then the communication becomes critical between the two teams, and depending on the time zone offset, you can run into real challenges when you're working in 12-hour time zone offsets versus slightly shorter ones. So a great team communication style becomes really critical of what's going on. And then you end up ensuring that you have the right type of experts in both sites, whether it's the privacy experts, security experts, the technical, infrastructure experts that understand. So you get a little bit of that duplication, but I believe the turnaround cycle becomes much more valuable to the company than some of the overhead.
Adding up to the continuous build, which I think it's a great thing, and companies should be doing. Always releasing discrete, small changes. Lower the risk in general. But we always talk about what we're doing together, or what we can do together, or how to build the software. But very few times we look at the entire process and try to see the parts that are just oversights, or QA and security are not working together properly. And one of the things that recently became pretty obvious in the industry is the continuous build, is the CI/CD process that we created, that a lot of times is created by or maintained by QA. And it's in a lot of cases, it's just not being properly protected from a security perspective. So take a look at SolarWinds, for example. We had a huge breach, and the problem was with TeamCity. Companies that were using TeamCity actually freaked out, because when they look at the potential threat that they had, if their TeamCity was also compromised, they noticed that those machines have the key to the kingdom. They have all the access to the entire source code. They have access to all the deployment machines. They have access to all your certificates and so on, and that's a big problem, right? And I think that's one of the areas that when we're building all this infrastructure, security is not always looking at the security of those machines and actually doing a good job safeguarding the access control and who has access and patching and so on.
I agree, and I think that one of the things that I've struggled with, in recent past, has been just mind shift change that is required, because you opened it, Sean, that you get the pushback of, well, it's not my job. I have to test the user experience. I have to test this. I have to test that. And just that mind shift to say, no, we need to start thinking about these bigger things. And we all on the team, whether you're a developer or the architect or the tester, have to take responsibility for that. It can't be just, I'm isolated to my one little area that I do, because as things go out the door much more quickly, we all have to stand up and take that responsibility to ensure that the customers are protected, and the infrastructures are protected. And that's been one of the biggest struggles, because there is a lot of pressure to ship more quickly.
Yeah, and I'm gonna mix it up a little bit here, because one of the things I like to do in this channel is really shift it left. Because my view is we're always trying to figure out what is the risk and how do we mitigate it. And I'm always confident that we can even go further and say, well, if we don't even introduce the risk in the first place, we don't have to mitigate it. So what I'm talking about here is a business process says we need to stand up this service connected to this mobile app and grab this data and store it and present it. And the question I often ask is, can we define the business process differently and then architect this stuff differently so that we're not capturing the data, we're not storing it, we're not exposing it through a service, we're not pumping it through a web app or a mobile app in a way that introduces the risk in the first place. So how does security / QA get involved in the business definition and then the architecture definition to help perhaps to avoid the company from going down a path that leaves them exposed over and over and over every time they do a CI/CD?
Yeah, so the way that security starts getting involved is before any code is actually built, right? With things such as threat modeling or even legal reviews. Try to understand what kind of data is going to be stored in the system and look from a privacy perspective. And from a privacy perspective, you can look at the regulation, right, related to privacy. So things like government IDs and things like that, which for most people are pretty obvious to be sensitive, to things that are not as, not often recognized as problems, right? For example, who you like, who you communicate with in a social network type of application and so on. So those are some of the things that you start looking before any code is actually written. And then in order to actually do shift left, you need a lot of the tools used in a different way that you have today. So for example, a static code analysis. They started just becoming too heavy for people to use. If you have millions or billions of lines of code, it can take up to a day to actually go through the static code analysis, which makes it impossible to shift left. Right, so new technology had to be invented, and some companies actually changed the way they're doing static code analysis, no longer compiling the code, and they lowered this time from sometimes one day to as low as an hour or 30 minutes to do the same analysis. It might not be as deep as before, but there's one big difference, which is now you have a tool that you can actually give to your developers. And they can actually analyze when they are writing the code. And when you're actually looking at the vulnerabilities created while you're writing the code, you can actually fix faster because everything is just still in your mind as an engineer. There's no need to actually create Jira tickets, review those tickets and do other things. And that really changed the process. But you do need to change your tools because the old tools that were out there that, Gartner and other praises, they are no longer the tools that you might need in order to do this kind of things. Likewise, you have your package management, which needs to be integrated with the tools they use in order to do your source code control. So a good package management, if you look at the vulnerable packages, will actually tell you, okay, this is a package that you download from the internet, has a vulnerability, and if you just auto-merge, you have 90% of chance of having to do nothing and get this fixed, right? While in the past, you would have to really be careful and QA, but having that information that other people actually updated and it just worked fine because the change was very discrete is very important. And then the last part is about configuring the machines. Dev needs machines to do their tests, so does QA. But whenever a new virtual machine is created and access control is created, it tends to be kind of loose for QA and dev, unless you have good blueprints, right? So use of technology such as Docker or Azure blueprints to say, okay, you can create a new VM, but if you create, the disk is going to be encrypted, you're going to use the latest version of TLS and so on, and there's no other way around it. It's really important in order to shift left and make things go faster.
And I would say, Sean, that one of the challenges as we look forward is, and you mentioned it, is we're spending a lot of time and effort and energy protecting things. And the question is there a system, is there a way, is there a solution that makes the information that we need to protect? I mean, why are we sending so much private information across all these systems? Why am I giving my social security number when I'm trying to, lease an apartment? How do we make these systems more isolated and so that what traditionally we would need to protect doesn't need to be protected, because if somebody gets it, it doesn't matter to them anymore. And, they can't do anything with it. And I think that that's a challenge to rethink how a lot of our systems are built, and the information that there is critical information that needs to be protected, but minimize its usage across all these systems. And that's a challenge for the inventors out there.
And that's pretty interesting, because at the same time that we see more privacy regulations, you see storage becoming cheaper, and people doing data lakes and things like that, and just collecting all the information they can, which sometimes from a security perspective become a data swamp, right? And a big liability for the company because the data is just there. One thing that I'm really curious to see how is going to turn out in the long run is we always talk about security at rest and security in transit. But now it seems that it's becoming a reality to do security or encryption. Encryption in transit, encryption at rest. But now encryption in processing is something that is becoming a reality. And it would be very interesting if we could do, for example, our taxes, send our seller information to, let's say, TurboTax encrypted. They could process encrypted and send you the results without ever seeing your salary, right? And I think we're getting there, and there's some companies, Google, Microsoft, they're already using this type of technology in order to check for passwords that have been breached and so on. So I'm really optimistic that something like that will really fundamentally change the way we build systems.
Yeah, it's an interesting scenario there, and something I've been thinking about quite a bit actually as well, not just for financial data, but personal health information and you name it, right? Tom, you mentioned social security number just to get a lease, and tons of other information that agencies look for when they're trying to verify who someone is. We're coming up on time here, so I want to take the last moment from each of you with a view for the future and hopefully a positive outlook here. My sense is we're measuring incorrectly. So if that's correct, how do we prepare for a future where security and privacy and QA come together for a better world where we're actually measuring the right thing, perhaps, to do what we're really trying to accomplish versus we spend all day looking at a screen in the SOC and we found 10 vulns or 10 incidents, and that's success, right? Tom?
Well, as engineers and people that build software, I think it does require that mind shift change that companies need to make, that engineering teams need to make. It's something that I know that over the years that I've struggled with a little bit, moving teams in that direction, get out of that. It's not my job because the thought of security has to be not just a compliancy issue, because we all have to deal with GDPR and California privacy laws and that, but it has to be a customer issue. It has to be something that protects them. They have to be the first and foremost, because if we're not protecting the customer, then we're out of business. And so that information has to come from that perspective. And if it does, then it obviously falls square onto the quality assurance team and the engineering teams to ensure that they're doing that. It can't just be it's another requirement that the legal has us do. And so that's where I see the teams needing to be much more closely integrated and communicative in what they're working on. And I don't think that there's a magic bullet for it. It's just a process change that companies need to make that effort to go through. And unfortunately, I think that, and I know you wanted positive, but I think we're going to see more things like the Equifax breach and the SolarWinds breach. And we're going to see more of those things to the point where customers are going to demand it. Because when things like Facebook breach, I just read, it's an older story, but they're hyping it up the last couple of days. If customers just ignore it, then it's never going to get fixed.
And for me, I see that as a positive, Tom. Just once the consumer gets involved, then we're doing our job. So, yeah. Cassio, wrap us up.
So I believe that security is always a cat and mouse game, right? As soon as we find something and we fix, the bad guys are going to find a way around it, and it's going to be like that forever. And the same thing with QA. It's just that QA is human, and as much as you can try to write the code, in a way that is bug free, you cannot achieve that. So what I believe is that the wrong answer is actually to say, okay, let's beat developers with a dead cat. That's something that QA shouldn't be doing and security should be doing. Instead, what we have to do is take a different approach than, for example, what the DMV does, which is you have to take a test to get your driver's license. You fail the test, to take it again. Let's make the test harder so that people won't commit mistakes, because people will always commit mistakes related to quality, and that includes QA and engineering. So what's the answer? The answer is exactly what we're doing today, which is to shift left, get the tools that will automate and make it harder for people to make the same mistakes they are doing. And that also includes to innovate out from the technologies that we have today. So, for example, we started with our own data centers with machines that we have to patch. We moved to VMs, then we moved to containers. And, now we have technologies that actually orchestrate containers and so on. And we're actually getting better and better in the way that we deploy technology that is safer. And that should be the same thing for the controls that we write in our software, and also the programming languages and the tools that we use in security.
I love it. And so I think to recap, the more we can focus on the customer, the better. And the more we can understand our own culture internally and have a dedicated, meaningful effort to improve it, so that we can actually shift left. It's not going to happen automatically. There's no magic bullet. I think both of those could sum it up quite nicely. Cassio, I know you mentioned OWASP. We're huge fans of OWASP. I'll ask both of you after we're done here to share some additional resources. We can put those in the show notes for tips of best practices, models to follow, frameworks to leverage, things like that. So folks interested can tap into some of your knowledge through those resources as well. So, Tom, Cassio, great to have you on, guys. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Sean.
EdgeScan offers continuous vulnerability intelligence as a service, accurately identifying vulnerabilities and exposures across the full stack. All threats are verified by cybersecurity experts, providing exploitable risk and remediation guidance, virtually false positive free. Learn more at edgescan.com. Archer empowers organizations to manage multiple dimensions of risk on one platform with on-premises and software-as-a-service offerings, and quickly implement industry-standard processes and best practices for advanced risk management maturity, informed decision-making, and enhanced business performance. Learn more at archerirm.com.
Imperva is the cybersecurity leader whose mission is to protect data and all paths to it with a suite of integrated application and data security solutions. Learn more at imperva.com.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Redefining Security podcast. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.